Welcome, everybody. So this is an important event for a few reasons. First of all, it's on Columbia campus. Second, it's on the day that commemorates the day of the departure and expulsion of Jews from the Arab countries and Iran. In 2014, the Israeli government instituted a law that this would be the day to commemorate it, and it's a day after the declaration of the UN of the partition in 1947 that was on the 29th of November. So just like in America, we instituted the Day of Native Americans right after Thanksgiving. The Israeli government decided that this is going to do that. So it recognized for the first time in itself that the Jews are native to the land. I want to start with a story that pertains to my family, of course, but pertains to many families that we call them really the forgotten refugees. And the class that I'm taking at Columbia now is about immigration and to all the immigrations in New York from every country. So everybody has a story of immigration, and every Jew has a story of immigration. But there's a point that is forgotten right now that when we see demonstrations and people that call Israel a white colonized land, we have to recognize that there's another side to that, and that the indigenousness of the Jews goes back very long time. So the story of my family, at least, is from Yemen, is that they were sent there as emissaries by King Solomon, probably around the meeting of Queen Sheba, and supposedly a lot of them were maybe Levites. That's why a lot of Yemenites have good voices and sing. And 4 times that Israel won the Eurovision contest, 3 of them were Yemenite singers. In 1951, of course, just shortly 3 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, there was a mass immigration, modern day exodus from Egypt, and nearly 40,000 Yemenite Jews left between 1949, the beginning of the operation of Magic Carpet, and it lasted for 2 years and ended with the second phase, which was on Wings of Eagles, when my parents came to Israel. So their journey was an incredible journey. My parents, that were young children, my mother was 5 and my father was 7, and one day they were told to pick up and go. And it took them a long time because the stress really started with the Zionist, of course, conflict in Israel. But this was the sign that we're all connected. All Jews around the world are connected because there was conflict in Israel and we were affected there. Last night, I had to insert this. Henry Kissinger passed away, and it reminds me of a story that when he came to Israel and he met with Golda Meir, he told her that when she asked for a military assistant, don't forget that he is first an American, second, he was a Secretary of State, and then third, he was Jewish. And Golda Meir looked at him and she said, Henry, that's great, but you forgot one thing, that in Israel, we read from right to left. So, which means that it doesn't matter what happens in the world, it affects all of us. And what's happening right now, we live it, that something is happening in Israel and we're all affected, even here on campus. So our purpose today is to educate and to show that the connection to the land of Israel didn't start just in 1948, but it really has, of course, 4,000 years of history. And we'll hear two wonderful speakers later on, Dr. David Sklar. And Dr. David Sklar is an old friend of mine from the days of before even the Jewish Theological Seminary, but he was in charge of the rare book room, and that was my sanctuary, coming to visit there. So today he's going to show through old manuscripts the connection of the Jews to the land. The second speaker, we have Michael Levinson, who's been working on his book for several years, and it's about to come out. He doesn't have a name for it, but it's the exploration of Jewish connection to Israel through the eyes of a diaspora Jew. One of the challenges of speaking about Jews from Arab countries and saying that they indigenous is not to mean necessarily, of course, that those who came from Europe are not indigenous to the land, and I think we'll learn it here also later on. I want to start by presenting why we created this event today. This event, this date is not really celebrated too much. Since 2014, we don't hear people commemorate it. But at times when we are blamed to be taking somebody else's land, this is a lot more complicated than that. So I want to start by the essential argument of the anti-Israel rhetoric boils down to the following. Jews are white Europeans who colonized the brown indigenous people. So this is a button that is being pushed over and over again. And of course, when we say, or people chant Free Palestine, what does that mean? I don't have anywhere to go back. My parents, my family never left the Middle East, and more than half of Jews who live in Israel today never left the area. The misguided premise of the anti-Israel message also created an American public perception that is firmly set on Jews being white Europeans. And of course, that's true. Most Jews in America are from Europe. But when Jews came from Europe in a place that did not accept them because they were not white enough, coming to America and being involved in this paradigm of black or white in a country also that offered citizenship and equality even 10 years before the French Revolution, it's no wonder that we liked the idea and we kind of fell in love with it. Today we want to educate that the picture is wider. And we'll hear stories also from people who came from other Arab countries and had their own stories. One of the things is that I feel today that we are in a place that is similar to the 1930s in one way, and very different, of course, in another way. The similarity is that people chant in the streets and make us feel uncomfortable. But on the other hand, we have a state, and Israel is a strong place for everybody. So this is the situation that we're in, and that feels like in history when we fought the Greeks, we fought other nations, that we were the few against the many. Of course, we are 15 million people in the world, the Jewish people, and there are many more those who criticize us. But I think there's a way to amplify also our messages through other means, and this is one of the means to amplify it, is to create these events, even if they're not in person attended, but even online, wherever you can, to shout this message. One of the articles in the Washington Post had an opinion article from the Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa on November 12th that was saying this Mizrahi Heritage Month, we must be united for Israel. Many of us don't present a white or white American story, but a different from many of our Ashkenazi friends. So how are we categorized by anti-Israel protesters? We'll start with the first speaker, David. You can, you'll come up here. And David is going to, he is just a few months ago curated the Golden Path, the Maimonides across 8 centuries, currently on view at the Center for Jewish History.
Thank you very much, Gadi. So Gadi and I go back a long way, connected in many, many ways. My role here, as I see it, is simply to provide some very broad historical context. And we're going to do this in a very specific way. Gadi mentioned, so I'm a historian of what's called early modern Jewish history, that's basically the 17th and 18th centuries. But I curated an exhibition that's currently on view downtown on 16th Street at the Yeshiva University Museum, which is in the Center for Jewish History. And it is an exploration of Maimonides, the great philosopher and legalist and physician, really the greatest Jewish thinker in 1,000 years. An exploration of him and his impact until today. And in discussing with Gadi, we figured that we can go through this, and I will just do a very quick overview, but as using it as a conduit to understanding Jewish history over this very broad period and how that provides context for what's so significant about tonight. Before we begin, though, with that, I should just mention, since I think that what's really important about this evening is personal stories and personal connections, is I will mention something about myself, which is that my last name is Sklar, and I would assume that all of you would assume that my own background is Ashkenazi, is European. But in fact, I come from a Sephardic family on my father's side. That is quite unusual. The story is one that I haven't heard previously, but it really is indicative of how complex life is and how complex Jewish history is, and that we shouldn't assume that we have categories that we must fit into. In our particular case, we're a Sephardic family that went from Spain to Italy. Exactly when, I could not tell you, but we know that the family was in Italy, in Venice, and they were glassmakers. The name Sklar is a Czech name, originally would have been Shklir, which means glassmakers. My grandfather was born in Lithuania. My father was born in South Africa. I was born in Minnesota. And I've gone my entire life being a Sephardic Jew with a deep connection to my past, but with one experience after another of people assuming that that can't possibly be. And I think that this is also significant, Gadi. In your case, we know your parents are both Yemenite, and this goes way back, centuries, millennia. But even if we imagine the Jews were in Europe at whatever point, it's really important to understand that there's complexity and nuance and significance to each place and to the various paths that we take, whether it's within Jewish history or otherwise. And that's ultimately, to me, what Jewish history offers. What we can offer is a nuanced view on life. So Moses ben Maimon, so Maimonides means the son of Maimon. He was the Rambam in Hebrew. He was born in Spain, in Cordoba, in Andalusia in 1138. He was a rabbi, a jurist, a philosopher, a physician. Very significantly, he was a communal leader, which is frequently lost, meaning we imagine that this great thinker, we sometimes do this with thinkers in general, disembodied minds or scholars in ivory towers, such as this auspicious place at Columbia University. But the fact is that he was devoted to community, at least devoted to the task at hand. He produced innumerable works, each revolutionary in law and philosophy, medicine, ethics, it goes on. Significantly, he wrote mainly in Judeo-Arabic. The reason, of course, is that the vast majority of Jews lived within an Islamic context at that time, in the 12th century. Judeo-Arabic is essentially the Arabic language, but written in Hebrew characters. Something close to this would be imagining that Yiddish is like a Judeo-German, Ladino is a Judeo-Spanish, but there are dozens of languages like this, Jewish languages where you have Judeo-Turkish, Judeo-Persian, and so forth. He settled in Egypt around 1168 in a place called Fustat, which is Old Cairo, and he lived about 3.5 decades until he died in 1204 in Fustat. Now, he was praised in his own lifetime. He was also controversial in his own lifetime, but that relates to philosophy. But there were Muslim philosophers and physicians who appreciated him, and also famously within Christendom, Aquinas famously connected with Maimonides on the philosophical side. We have a quote here, Galen's medicine. This is from Ibn Abi Asuyabiyah, and he lived in the 13th century. He had produced this massive sort of biographical encyclopedia of physicians, and he wrote, Galen's medicine is for the body only, but Maimonides' medicine is for mind and body. If he were to treat time, he would cure it of ignorance with knowledge. Now, what's fascinating about Maimonides, for us, historically, is that we actually have documents in his own hand, and this relates to something known as the Cairo Geniza. Geniza is a repository, ultimately, for holy texts that are deemed holy, usually. In the Yiddish word would be referred to as shemus, like shemot. It would be God's name, and you don't just discard this in the garbage, but instead you collect it and ultimately bury it. But in the Islamic context, there was a practice also to sometimes place it in an attic. In this particular case, the attic of a famous Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat, also on the walls of the synagogue. And in the late 19th and the early 20th century, Western scholars, Western Jewish scholars, such as the gentleman here, Solomon Schechter, got wind that there were hundreds of thousands of fragments there. They took them out. He ultimately, Schechter, carted away about 135,000 fragments off to Cambridge University. And it's really fascinating what has been discovered. It's not just quote-unquote holy texts, but also letters and business documents and grocery lists and recipes and things like that, and various reasons as to why you have historical documents such as this. As a side note, there is, at the exhibition, if you so desire to see it downtown, there is a 1,000-year-old Torah ark door from the Ben Ezra synagogue, and this is a picture of it. And this is something that Maimonides himself would have seen. But you can notice, just in terms of the art, this is all reflecting the Islamic context in which Jews are living. Now, as examples of documents that were discovered in the Cairo Geniza, related again to Maimonides, what we see, these are 3 examples of which we have, the one in the center is actually presently on view in the exhibition, the other 2 were on view. The one on the left is a draft of his what's known as the Mishneh Torah, which is this great legal code that he produced. This is something truly significant because the fact that you can see it, even if you couldn't read it, you can notice that this great thinker is somebody who edited his own work. He had to go over it and think, and this is something that, for those of us who teach, it's very important to impart to students that no, it's not, your initial idea is not the perfect idea. You have to challenge it, you have to dig deeper. And this relates directly to the issue that we're ultimately discussing here, which is, what is education? The document on the right is actually quite relevant because it is a letter, a circular, there would have been many of these that were sent out. You can actually see his signature on the bottom, Moshe Bar Maimun. This letter is asking to communities to raise funds to ransom captives, Jewish captives, people who had been taken hostage during the Crusades. And currently on view, we have actually a receipt to something of similar effect, also with his name on it. We have other examples of books, in fact, manuscripts, codices, that were never lost, meaning they were never placed into the Geniza, but these, in fact, were manuscripts that were treasured. Now, I could go in, each of these tells a story, and you could have a lecture about each of these things. The particular reason that I'm mentioning them now is because we know where these went. We know they were in Egypt. We know that they ended up in Aleppo. Now they're presently in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. But we have Jewish communities throughout North Africa, throughout the Middle East. The page on the left it actually includes another signature from him. Basically, this was the manuscript is a Mishneh Torah, again, this code, this legal code. He's not the author of this particular manuscript. He wrote the text. He had a scribe copy it, and then he included his signature, which you can see in the center, and it says, Hugam Sifri Ani Moshe B'Rabbi Maimun. In Huga, in this case, it would mean proofread in one way, but in this particular case, in the Islamic context, it's more of an authorization. He's authorizing that this has been checked against his own personal copy. The scribe copied it correctly. I'm now authorizing this. There is a scholar in Oxford, Judith O'Sully-Schlanger, who's actually been working on this. And this idea is actually referred to as an ijaza, an Arabic term, which basically refers also to copyright. It's all very, very interesting, but it, again, is something that's significant that we even have it in his own hand. Now moving very quickly, we have manuscripts. Maimonides has had a massive impact and a wide-ranging impact. So we have manuscripts in the following centuries after his death. From Provence, in this case this is a medical text, from Ashkenaz, which would be sort of Franco-Germany, and you'll notice the menorah like this, with the arches, like we know from the Arch of Titus 2,000 years ago. This is in Rome. We have illuminated manuscripts. This is also Ashkenaz. Notice that the date is 1349. Anybody who thinks about what took place in Europe in 1348-49, famously this is the Black Death, which scholars today are now assessing that perhaps half of Europe's population passed away during the plague, the spread of the plague in those 2 years. What may be significant for us today, when it means that here you have an illuminated manuscript, even during something so difficult, because we continue to live our lives, even through horrible challenges. Again, this is another page related to what's called Moreh Nevuchim, which is his great philosophical text. We have manuscripts from Yemen. This is a Mishneh Torah from the 15th century. These are also from Yemen, and for Gadi's sake, I'll just point out the manuscript on the right is called Sefer HaMitzvot, which is Maimonides' account or sort of listing of all the commandments. The one on the left is another Mishneh Torah, that's the legal code, and you'll notice the menorah, the menorah from the temple, and it's these straight-armed branches, which is unusual. If we go back for 1 second, this is the one that we would be see regularly, and certainly those are the depictions that we generally have in the menorah. However, this shows Yemenite Jews' connection to Maimonides because they essentially copied from what they understood was Maimonides' original intention. We have Yemenite examples of how this menorah appears. Anyway, we then move to printing. We're moving very quickly. We then move to printing. Jews are active and extremely influential printers. It's not that there's some estimate that there are 30,000 titles that are printed in the first, in Europe in the first 3 or so, or 4 decades, first 4 decades of printing. Only 150 of those were probably Hebrew titles, meaning if you can imagine 30,000 books being printed and then only 150 are Hebrew. Having said that, Jews are the first to establish printing presses in Portugal, in North Africa, in the Ottoman Empire. Hebrew printing predated Turkish language printing by far more than 200 years. Here we have these Mishneh Torah examples, including one that included commentaries here, printed in Constantinople, Istanbul in 1509. With printing, what's fascinating about printing is that sometimes it means that ideas can be disseminated widely, but once it's fixed, meaning once an item is printed, if there is a mistake that was made in the printing, it means that is set in stone almost. It's set now in type. And you might have 1,000 copies that are now disseminated so widely, and that means that mistake is disseminated widely. Scholars were aware of this. This is an example of, I mentioned Aleppo before. This page on the right is famously the Aleppo Codex, which is among the handful of 10th century Bibles that exist. It's now, it's in Israel, but it was in Aleppo for many, many, many centuries. And the page on the left refers to a scholar where he had basically taken this Mishneh Torah that had been printed in Venice, and he had compared it to a famous manuscript that was in Aleppo. This Aleppo being Syria, because the scholar knew that, okay, there are mistakes in the printed text, and I have to now go back and see what it was like, what it says in the manuscript. As a side note, this just relates to the general topic for this evening. Sometimes you'll have Maimonides was ubiquitous, so his books were continuously printed, continuously appearing. This is very interesting because it was a legal text that was produced in Venice. It's not particularly large, produced in Venice in 1665. Just as the printer was finishing it, he got wind that there was a Jewish Messiah who had just arrived. He'd been told in the letter that he was going to come riding on the lion. It was going to be a fire-breathing lion. In this particular case, this is the first printed reference to Shabtai Tzvi, whom you may have heard of famously. He was the center of the greatest Jewish Messianic movement in history. He was a Turkish Jew, and basically the announcement that he was the Messiah came from a young Kabbalist named Nathan of Gaza. Jews lived in Gaza. This printer in Venice had received word of this. He was so excited, so enthusiastic about the desire that now the Messiah has arrived, and Shabtai was going to be riding this lion, leading the 10 lost tribes, and they were all going to be able to go back to Jerusalem. This is in the 1660s. It ended very badly. Shabtai ultimately converted to Islam, and what became known as Sabbatianism became essentially a heretical movement or multiple movements, and it's a fascinating story in its own right. Having said that, we then move on. Jews are all over the place. So even when I mentioned before about Europe, I mentioned my own family history. There's nuance to all of this. This is from a library catalog for the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam. These were Jews whose ancestors had essentially were what are known as conversos. The derogatory term for them was Marranos, which basically the Portuguese Jews had been, these conversos had been, they were sort of new Christians, but not able or sometimes unwilling to convert fully internally, so to speak, to Christianity. So they retained some Jewish tradition and basically in the 17th century and into the 18th century, many of these Portuguese Jews left Portugal, left Spain, went to Bordeaux, went to Amsterdam, went to Hamburg and London, and ultimately to New Amsterdam, to New York, and lived overtly as Jews. They were the first to establish an institutional library. It still exists. It's more than 400 years old. It's called the Eitz Chaim Library. It originated as part of a yeshiva. They have a library catalog. There are multiple library catalogs. This is from the 18th century, and the list on the right specifically lists Maimonidean texts, meaning he was so significant to them that they kept them separate, it seems. Moving into where we are essentially with modern scholarship, you had people like Mori Steinschneider, who was a German Jew, who learned Arabic, was able to read the original text. Remember, I mentioned that Maimonides wrote in Judeo-Arabic, and now manuscripts were very important. And scholarship essentially meant to getting back to sort of asking about what is original, trying to establish a bibliography of Jewish history, printing new texts. But you have this also on a religious side of things in the 19th and 20th centuries, and in Yemen specifically, you have Yihya Kafich on the right, and his grandson Yosef Kafich, who was a great scholar and editor and translator of Maimonides and other scholars. Just to sort of conclude with where we are today, with Jews really all over using Maimonides with this notion that Jews are throughout the world and regularly producing. Even amid the Holocaust, there was a yeshiva in Lithuania that had made its way there were multiple yeshivot that had made their way to Shanghai. They printed Mishnah Torah in 1943. And then in the modern day, there's a fascination with the artistic depiction of Maimonides. And here are these three portraits, all producing, or all representing Maimonides in very different ways, even though they were produced all within a handful of years. The origin of this sort of portrait of Maimonides is from Venice, 1744. It's essentially a man, imagining a man with a turban and a beard and a robe. But the fact is that you had Sephardic Jews in the land of Israel, for instance, drawing their own portraits. And then today, where we are, is Maimonides being sort of ubiquitous in every country. The amulet on the left, that page on the left, is very interesting because it basically proclaims Maimonides. You can see the portrait on the bottom right. It basically proclaims him as a Kabbalist, which of course he was a philosopher, so he would be in opposition to that. And then famously, this is the statue of Maimonides in Cordoba that was erected in 1983. If you're interested, there is an exhibition to see. This was all very quick, but the main point, of course, was just to give an overview for the sake of understanding the nuance and the complexity of Jewish history. You cannot argue with somebody who is not interested in having an argument. If a person is simply going to say whatever they're going to say, but they're not going to stop talking to hear anything, then there's nothing you can say. I do not consider myself an advocate of anything. My point here is simply that the truth is what's significant. And that's what scholarship is ultimately about. And that's where, even if we were to take the significance of the Israeli government proclaiming this as such an important day, it took until 2014. Mm-hmm. This speaks to the problems internally within Israel, that it took so long for recognition of people who are not Ashkenazic, so to speak. And so the issues that we're facing here with all of this is that it's not a single sort of issue of advocacy. It's rather, Jews were in Babylonia, in modern-day Iraq, 2,500 years ago, long before Arabs ever left Arabia, long before Islam developed, long before Christianity. That doesn't have to mean anything except that it's a fact. And what do you do with these facts? There was never a point at which Jews were not in the land of Israel. So where does the word Palestine come from? There's history to this. And it means that Palestinians also can understand that there's significance to what their own history is. But it means also that there are Arab villages in Israel that were founded in the 19th century. I have a cousin who, in another part of the family, they can trace themselves back in Jerusalem 9 generations. There's a lot you can do in terms of each statement does not have to mean the totality of anything. It's simply, what do we do as we pursue the truth and justice and a desire to live in peace? I mean, there's so much complexity here that any thought that we're going to simply have the answer just like that, it should be.
I mean, you just showed the bridge between Europe, Spain, and Egypt, through a man who was the bridge of both. Yes. So definitely I feel like we are a bridge between East and West, but we are recognized more in the modern age as a Western country, and that really is missing half of the picture, and that's why we're here, to complete that picture. Thank you very much, David. This was fascinating as always. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Michael Levinson, and he only speaks 12 languages. Sorry about that. You know what they say about a person who speaks 2 languages, bilingual, 3 languages, or trilingual, 1 language, American. So clearly Michael is pursuing the word, and he speaks Hebrew. Among the languages that he speaks is Hebrew, Yiddish, and Persian. And we'll hear more of his story and his husband's story as we continue. So Michael also graduated from Columbia College in 2004 with a BA in Middle Eastern languages and cultures. So, we are looking forward to reading his new book that will come out shortly.
My name is Michael Levinson. As Gadi mentioned, I graduated from Columbia in 2005 with the BA in Middle Eastern languages and cultures. I've had a variety of professional experiences in the last 20 years, and but the thing that I've always come back to, both when I had jobs where I needed to support myself, was tutoring and teaching Hebrew school, and then using that knowledge and the knowledge that I gained from my bachelor's degree for volunteer work to educate people who wanted to be educated, to your point, people who wanted to know about what is the other side of the story. Most recently, I did that during COVID with somebody who turns out is a third cousin of mine, because genealogy is part of a passion of mine. She is not Jewish because that branch of the family stopped being Jewish, and she really wanted to know everything. And COVID was a transition time for a lot of people, myself included, and I spent the better part of a year teaching her everything that I already knew, everything that I also didn't know yet. In teaching this third cousin of mine, I created a Google document to share to go along with our sessions. It was recently suggested to me that it would be an interesting book topic, and so it's not quite upcoming yet, but there is about 200 pages worth that have been written in the spirit of wanting to honor this evening. And when Gadi explained to me what this was about for him, what really resonated with me was, you didn't share this, so I'm going to share it for you, that you said that you talked in a class of yours here at Columbia about being a Yemenite descended Jew, and that people hadn't heard of this. I really welcome the opportunity to have this event and to hear. I'm very anxious to hear from some of the speakers who can talk personally about their own family stories. But the other piece of it that Gadi mentioned was this concept of indigenousness, and as you alluded to before, this sort of notion that Israel is a white settler colonialist state, that Jews are white, and that somehow there's a connection to, I think, that ignorance and the ignorance of the existence of Yemenite Jews and indeed Jews from all over the Middle East. It sort of doesn't surprise me if you think about that. So I think it's a worthwhile exploration, and in the book that I'm working on, I'm exploring who are the Jewish people, what is the Jewish people's connection to Israel, and very importantly, this is me, ordinary diaspora Jew. This should give you a flavor, and I have a feeling just based on who's in the room that most of you will probably already be fairly familiar with most of what I'm about to say, but the idea is that this book is for people who aren't familiar with it, so just bear that in mind. And to kind of place this event and this commemoration of specifically Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews in the wider context of the Jewish people. Yes, we have these different geographical locations, but we're one people who have been scattered. I just want to start with Psalm 137 because I think it speaks to history and much of what we just heard about and what we're talking about today. And you might be familiar with the reggae song. I know that's probably the first time I ever heard it, and I love that song. And if you aren't familiar with it, look it up on YouTube. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there, they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? So we all know where Babylon is, and that's sort of the genesis of much of the communities that we're talking about here in Iraq. Because I have hearkened to this, I want to just kind of define quickly for people who might not know, what exactly is Zion that we hear so much about? So this is Zion, right? This is a map of ancient Jerusalem, what is now the old city. But how is it used in many of the manuscripts, for example, that Dr. Sklar probably is familiar with? So in the book of Samuel and the book of Kings, Zion is frequently used to refer to a fortress on the southeast of Jerusalem below the Temple Mount, later renamed the City of David. That's one meaning of Zion. In many Jewish texts later on, in poetry, liturgy, Zion is what's called a synecdoche, which is a kind of a fancy word for synonym, for Jerusalem. It's more than a synonym. It's like taking a piece of something that is emblematic of something greater. Eventually becomes a metonymy, which is another fancy word for synecdoche, for Judea, also known as Judah, in the book, the writings of Isaiah, or the people of Judea. In Joel and Psalms, it frequently seems synonymous with the Temple Mount, specifically. And by the first century of the Common Era, the whole of that elevation that we're looking at here is the city of David and the Temple Mount. That is Zion, okay? So it's the heart of the Jewish homeland. Zion is mentioned 152 times in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. In the Tanakh, Zion is overwhelmingly a poetic and prophetic designation and is infrequently used in ordinary prose. It usually has emotional and religious overtones arising from the importance of Jerusalem as the royal city and the city of the temple. And in the book of Isaiah and in the book of Psalms, Mount Zion is the place where God dwells and from where God rules. And then how does it relate? So this is a little glimpse into the crux of what I'm writing about in my book, which is, okay, great for all the history, all the Hebrew school lessons, all the whatever a rabbi might say. How does it relate to me, Michael Levinson, Jew? So here's one example. Every Saturday, right, and if you grew up in New York and were a Jewish kid, every Saturday at age 13 you went to shul or to synagogue. Every Saturday we take the Torah out of the ark, and the congregation sings, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah u'devar ad Hashem Yerushalayim. For out of Zion shall go forth the Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Right? Heard it every Saturday. The fifth wedding blessing, which we recited 5 years ago, a couple of weeks ago. The fifth, so everybody knows the Jewish wedding, there's a chuppah, somebody steps on the glass, you dance the hora. There's also 7 blessings that are recited, and the fifth one translates to the barrenness, which refers to a particular strip of land, will surely exult and be glad in gathering her children to herself joyfully in haste. Blessed are you, Lord, gladdener of Zion, by way of her children. Prayer of comfort for mourners. If you go to temple when somebody's marking a yard site, or you go into a house of mourning during Shiva. Hamakom yinachem etchem betoch she'ar avalei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May the omnipresent one comfort you among the remnant mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And this is our wedding picture, stepping on the glass. Now here, this is not a mention of Zion, but as I've said, we've established Zion is synonymous essentially with Jerusalem. And what do we say before this moment? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand lose its skill. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of thee. If I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. And I can certainly attest, and you'll meet my husband a little bit later, and you'll understand why this was definitely my happiest hour. And then we step on the glass because we remember the destruction of the temple in our happiest hour. So all of that was really just to explain this psalm by the rivers of Babylon, why we remembered Zion, why Judaism is essentially remembering Zion from one rite of passage to another, and from one moment of community to another. So a little bit of history. Why were they in Babylon? Why were they standing there remembering it and weeping? The Babylonians conquered Jerusalem in 597 before the Common Era. Following standard Mesopotamian practice, they exiled the Jewish elites and leadership from Jerusalem. The deportations were large, but certainly didn't involve the entire nation. Somewhere around 10,000 people were forced to relocate to the city of Babylon. As a result, in 586 BC, the kingdom of Judah ceased to be an independent kingdom, and the earlier deportees found themselves without a homeland, without a state, and without a nation. This period begins what we call the exile in Jewish history. And you see the route that they were supposed to have taken from Judah to Babylonia. And just a couple of points, because you, Rabbi Gadi, were talking about indigenousness and asking some important questions about where's the proof, and we saw some, lots of interesting examples from Dr. Sklar. There's lots of examples of mentions of Judah, right? The Aleppo Codex, I think you had in the previous presentation, 920 CE from Tiberias, the Dead Sea Scrolls from dating to between 100 and 300 BC in Qumran. and then a non-Jewish source documenting the Babylonian exile. The Al Yehuda tablets are 200 clay tablets that document the exiled Judean community in Babylonia. They come from the archives of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, and they reference King Jeconiah of Judah and mention the house of Adonai and the first temple as described in the Jewish narrative. So there's historical correlation, which I think is important. And then, of course, as I just said, that we're remembering Zion. Judaism is remembering Zion. These are all examples throughout history, and David Sklar made the important point that there has never been a moment in history where there weren't Jews in Israel. I would add to that, there has never been a century where Jews did not return to Israel from other places. So we frequently, a lot of people know about political Zionism in the 1880s, and Jews returned en masse from Europe, and then we're going to hear about the expulsion from Arab lands. But they also, after each of these events that I have listed here, there are recorded returns to the land in smaller groups. What did we do with the fact that we were exiled and no longer had a state? This is, we became a nation. I would say we probably already were. What is a nation, after all? According to Professor Anthony D. Smith, London School of Economics, in his book, National Identity,
a nation is a named population sharing an historic territory, common myths and historical memories, a mass public culture, a common economy, and common legal rights and duties for all members.
The major hallmarks of culture are language, religion, and customs. The named human population is often an ethnicity which shares a collective proper noun, Jews, a myth of common ancestry, the Torah. Sorry I'm offending people by calling it a myth, but in anthropological terms, it's mythology. Shared historical memories, Jewish history and everything from the previous presentation we heard about. One or more differentiating element of common culture, Hebrew language, Jewish religion, Jewish customs, a common economy and legal rights. I would argue that's halakha. If anyone's ever read a ketubah, you can see how that's both law and economy at the same time. A sense of solidarity for significant sectors of the population. Go to any synagogue, Jewish community center, the alphabet soup of Jewish organizations in this country alone. I'm gonna kind of skip a little bit here. This, I just put up a map of what is thought to be basically the kingdom of Israel and its boundaries in ancient times. And what I wanted to say in relation to Jews, where the Jews went and where they came from and who's indigenous to where, and Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, we know they were expelled. And the question is,
where did the Jews go? And my answer to that is a paradox. Obviously they went places, but I would also argue that they didn't go anywhere. The boundaries, the borders changed around them, right? So on the left is the extent of the Roman Empire.
Judea is squarely in the Roman Empire, but so is Cordoba that we just heard of, and Venice, and Tunis, and Algeria.
So imagine, if you would for a moment, that the Roman Empire never fell. And this is what the country looks like.
It would be something kind of like Russia or Canada or the United States. Imagine somebody moving from New York to California. It happens all the time, right? But so people moved around within the context of a country, of an empire, and then history happens and borders change again and again. We move from the Roman Empire to the Byzantine Empire. But same story. It's an empire, a vast place where the Jews were shuffled around. From there, we have the Rashidun Caliphate, right? This is the Arab conquest of the land of Israel. And I'm obviously skipping in history. I'm not showing you every empire that ruled over this land, but just giving you a broad sense of every 500 years. If you look at a map, then we get to the Mamluk Sultanate. Again, Israel is part of Egypt and part of Syria.
And then, of course, finally to the Ottoman Empire from the 1500s to the 1900s. And you could see that Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Greece, the Balkans are all joined in the same empire, 500 years. America is how old? 200 and, can't do math in my head, not my strong suit. Whatever it is, 250 years old, right? Imagine in another 250 years, what it might look like. And is somebody who was born in New York at this time and moved to California, not from New York anymore, kind of thing. That's where what I kind of get into in that section of my writing. And then finally, I come to this comment, but wait a minute, isn't Judaism a religion, right? This is something that people, especially in this country, have a difficult time understanding. So let's understand it. What is ism?
What is the suffix ism? Baptism, Calvinism, sexism, colloquialism, criticism. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, one of the usages of the suffix is it is used to form the name of a system, school of thought, or theory based on the name of its subject or object, or alternatively on the name of its founder. And so this brings me to my second bit of confusion, I think, which is American English. Right? I don't know how you all grew up saying it. My religion is Judaism. And when you say it like that, it kind of sounds like you are worshiping one of these people. Does everybody recognize? Yes. Okay. Judge Judy, Judy Garland, Judy Jetson, right?
Judaism, that's what we call it. There's such a disconnect between what we call it and what it is. So so if I go back to that, the relevant definition used to form names of a tendency of behavior, action, state, condition, or opinion belonging to a class or group of persons, or the result of a doctrine, ideology, or principle, or lack thereof, right? That's the relevant definition. There were several of the use of ism. So what is, it's not Judaism, it's Judaism. So what's Judah, right? This is Judah. Judah was a kingdom that after the united monarchy that was Israel, the kingdom of Israel split into the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. In Hebrew, it's Yehudah.
That became Hellenized into Greek, Judea, which became Judea in Latin. The I becomes a J, so on and so forth. You see how we get from Yehudah to Judah, or Judea. Mentioned in the Hebrew Bible by the ancient historian Josephus, the historical record, archaeology. The Nimrud tablet talks about Judah from 729 BCE in Assyrian cuneiform. Sennacherib's Annals, 690 BCE, from the Assyrian city of Nineveh, also mentions an Akkadian language using cuneiform script, Judah. The Arad Ostraka, discovered in Tel Arad, 600 BC, clay shards containing, among earliest local references to Judah. So to answer your earlier question, Rabbi, there is plenty of evidence of who we are and where we came from.
And I, for good measure, threw in a map from 1884, printed in Arabic, and it's a map of the climate of a botanical map of Syria.
Side note that this is part of Syria in 1884. And what it says in the circle part in Arabic is Jibal al-Yahudiyya.
Over here on the right is a legend, and it's just explaining the different, like this is the coastal plain, these are those, the barrens that I mentioned in the fifth wedding prayer, and this part is the mountainous region. But what do they call it specifically in Arabic? What do the Arabs call it to this day? Al-Jibal al-Yahudiyya. The Jewish mountains, or the Judean mountains, because they're the mountains of Judah.
So, if I go back to my definition of ism and my definition of Judah, I would suggest that Judaism is the tendency of behavior or action belonging to the people of Judah,
including as the result of their doctrine, ideology, and principles. Or put more simply, Judaism is the ways of the people of Judah, including their religion.
And after all, if I go back to the Hebrew, Yehudah is Judah. What's a person from Judah called in Hebrew? Yehudi. A person from Judah, from Yehudah. And to this day in Hebrew, how do you say that someone is Jewish? If you ask somebody what's your religion or whatever, Ani Yehudi.
I'm Jewish, meaning I'm from Judah. I'm a Judean. And in exile, the Jewish people continue to practice their customs, the ways of Judah, and their religion, the worship of God, both in stark contrast to the places they lived for most of history. And because of this contrast, in the passage of time, the customs and the religion merged in many respects and certainly came to be thought of as one concept of Judaism. And I think I'll basically stop because I have too much. And no, actually, I can end with just saying that I think one of the reasons it's hard for us in America to understand is that we live so a lot of the world, I would argue, particularly Europe, Africa, and Asia, are made up of nation states, states that are formed around an ethnic group, a dominant ethnic group. So in France is the nation state of the French people. Italy is the nation state of the Italian people. America isn't a nation state. America is like a political unity of lots of different peoples, which is why we all have hyphens in our identities: Italian American, Irish American, African American, Jewish American.
I think it's hard for people, for Americans to even understand the concept that, that there's a duality to saying I'm an American and I'm a Jew. As an American, it's a sort of civic identity, part of, if you will, a kind of Anglophone empire. That's a democracy, but a kind of empire. But it's made up of people with different complicated identities.
I think another reason that it's difficult for people to grasp is that we like to put everything in boxes. Even you applying to this school, please check the box. Are you white? Are you African American? Are you this? Are you that? What's your religion? Christianity and Islam are religions that spread through various means: conquest, conversion, influence, mass conversions of kingdoms or societies. And they began, frankly, as philosophical departures from the main practices of where they grew. So it's easy to convince somebody or explain to somebody that this is a new philosophy.
And then people say, oh, but then there's this Judaism, and that's a religion too. We didn't spread that way. We spread physically throughout all of those maps that I showed, but we didn't spread the ideas in the same way, because being Jewish was not an idea. It's a people.
I would like to ask this question or statement that when we started this evening, we knew that the impression would be that our answer to anti-Israel misled propaganda that Israel is a white colonized nation is because we wanted to show that that is not necessarily our point, that all Jews are native to the land. And I think between David and Michael, we see that when we talk about the indigenousness of Jews in the land, doesn't only mean the brown side of the Jews. We're all connected to that. I would add that, of course, for thousands of years, even when we were not in the land, we kept referring to the land. We kept pointing to the land. We were praying to the land. So we never left the land, really. So maybe we'll now also, as you said, we spread out, but we didn't spread out too far.
Yes.
So now we'll maybe hear a couple of stories of other people from Arab countries.
I am Francine Glick, and I was born in the class of 1977. And thank you so much for having me here tonight. I appreciate it. This is actually the first time I'm telling my story with more than two people. So when I was sitting here before, my husband turned to me and he said, "Did you bring notes?" And I thought, I'm telling my life story. I don't think I need notes, but after seeing all of these, I don't know, maybe he was right. I should have brought some notes. But anyway, before I tell you my story, I wanted to tell you a little bit about being a refugee and what that means to me. About 7 years ago, I was listening to a speaker who was a Cuban refugee. And she said, you know, as a refugee and her family, they always told her, don't make any waves, no controversy, nothing. And that really resonated with me because I can be pretty controversial. It was actually the first time that I saw myself as a refugee, which was really strange. But my parents never talked about us as being refugees. They said we were kicked out of Egypt, but they never used the word refugee. So I never identified with being the refugee. Anyway, so I am from Egypt. I was born in 1956 in Alexandria, Egypt. And people always ask me, you know, you think it's an easy question, like, oh, where are you from? And I'm like, oh, do you want the short version or do you want the long version? And I start with, I was born in Alexandria, Egypt. And they look at me like I have two heads. Like, what were you doing there? Well, my family lived there. Are you Egyptian? No, my family was French. French? Why were you French? Why were you living in Egypt? So, long story. Anyway, so I was born in 56. 56 is also the year that was the 56 Suez War, when the canal was nationalized. So my family had lived in Egypt for a while. On my father's side, his family had come from Spain via, I think maybe Morocco, but they were living in Egypt. On my mother's side, her father was from France and her mother was from Greece. So real mixture from everywhere. Good food though, good food. So after I was born in 56, the war broke out. And when I was about 6 months old, my parents were told they had to leave the country. And they had been living very well there. They had a very nice life and were very, very comfortable. And they had French nationality. Apparently, this is what they told me, they were able to trade in their French nationality for a Spanish passport. And because of that, they were able to stay a couple more years. So we left in 1958 and we went to live in France. Now there was a little problem because my father was trying to work and you had to be French to work, and he had just given up his French nationality. So he tried to explain that they were French, but French didn't want to hear about it. So ultimately we came to the United States when I was 3. We came to New York and we lived on 100 and Riverside Drive, so not very far from here. So the rest of the family kind of went all over the place. My mother had 2 brothers, and they were both studying in France at the time, and they were there. My father had 5 siblings, so we had a brother who came to 100 and West End Avenue, which is why we ended up on 100 and Riverside Drive. A sister that went to Brazil, and 3 sisters that went to Israel. So the family got, you know, kind of all spread out all over the place. And French was my first language, so I learned French. When I came here and I started kindergarten, I went to PS 75, which is on 96th and West End. And I did not know a word of English. I knew nothing. And so I learned English. And when about 5th grade, my mother said, no, after 5th grade, you're going to the French school. So I ended up by going to the Lycée Français in New York, and I did all my studies I went back to learning French and studied everything in French. And then after that, I came here and I was a transfer student for some reason because they gave me a year's credit. So that's kind of my story. It's been, usually kids, I think kids, whatever environment they grow up in, they think that's how everyone's environment is because that's all they know. But for me, it was the opposite. I was always different from everyone else. From the time I went to school and my mother would give me pizza bread to eat and everybody else had Wonder Bread, to everything else that we did in the family. I mean, we were pretty tight within the family. My parents really didn't socialize very much outside of our unit.
Hello. I also don't have a lot of notes, so I will improvise a little bit. My name is Julie Gage, and this last name is a very Sephardic name. It's often associated in North African Jewish communities. So Gage in Arabic means grandfather. So I was born in Marseille, in the south of France. Regarding the whole topic about all Jews are white colonizer, me coming here and when I had to check the box, I'm like white. I don't feel like I fit into this box. Most of the time, when you're not Jewish, especially in France, where I grew up, people were always asking me, so where are you from? Because you look white. And I was asking my parents are from Algeria and Tunisia. And they were like, oh, cool, so you do Ramadan or something like. So I'm like, no, I'm Jewish. And a lot of people have no idea that it was Jewish from North Africa. So same, the way I grew up in France, at home, we didn't have camembert. We had mostly in terms of foods, Northern African food like couscous, and this is like the tradition. We're very strong in terms of cultural tradition. So yeah, my dad was born in Batna, Constantine, in 1954, and he left Algeria after the war in 1962 when he was 8 years old. So there's like some kind of, when I try to speak to him about the way he lived his childhood, and I can feel a little bit of trauma about his past and about, I don't know, like, yes, anti-Semitism in Algeria mostly, most of the, especially during the Vichy regime, and also the link between Arabs and Jewish people. But yeah, and my mom in Tunisia, she was in Tunis. For most of the Jewish people in Tunisia, they left around 1948, 1952. They were living pretty much in peace between Arabs and Jews. So yeah, yeah. No problem. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Tomer Sinai, and I was born and raised in Israel. I've made clip notes right before I came here. I want to briefly share my father's family story, who came to Israel from Baghdad, Iraq. My grandfather was a railway station manager in Iraq, and the family used to live at the different train station that he managed. They frequently had to move from one place to another because that's what the job entailed. My father had 8 siblings, so needless to say, I have many cousins. And the older ones, who are now in their 80s, remember their childhood in Iraq very, very well. I too really like genealogy, so I asked them as many questions as I could. It's on my to-do list to write the family history. Of course, I'm sure it will happen down the line because it's very important. So my family lived as Jews, but they were not Orthodox.
They did have Shabbat dinners and observed the Jewish holidays. They had bar mitzvahs, etc., but they did not keep Shabbat because they lived amongst the Arabs. Since they lived somewhat remote from the center of Baghdad,
they were the only Jewish family around. Most of their neighbors were Shiite Muslims. My uncle said that when he went to public school, they told him to leave the classroom when they had religious class because he was a Jew, an outsider. He didn't really have any friends other than his older siblings. 10 years before they left was the Farhud, which was a pogrom of the Jewish people in Iraq. It was a 2-day pogrom.
I learned that in one instance, my grandfather was even stabbed in the stomach and then pretended to be dead amongst the numerous bodies in the street. After they collected the bodies, the police collected the bodies with him among them, he found a moment to escape. It was a very big trauma for him until his dying day.
I can't read Arabic, but Michael, who speaks 12 languages, helped me figure out Arabic. Arabic is one of them. I think this one is my dad's. I think one of those. But my father's original Arab name was Farouk, and his name when they came to Israel, they changed it to Abraham. All of the siblings had Arab names, and some of them, the older ones, kept their original names. Still in Israel, they're all still alive, and some of them Hebraicized it. My dad was one of them, but in his mind, his parents called him Farouk. Farouk, come here, and I spoke with him today before this gathering, and he told me that until their last days, they still called him that way. And I could hear the crackle in his voice when he said that. I just wanted to show you one more thing. This is the family picture, the original family picture on the passport. And this is my dad right there. This is something very important. This is a stamp that, thanks to Michael, I found out what it says. And what it reads right here, to those who can't see, it reads, "Never permitted to return to Iraq," on the passport. So along with many Iraqi Jews, my family came to Israel in 1951 and stayed in a refugee camp for several years in a tent for 5 years. They always talk about how rainy that year was and that it constantly flooded. They came from a wealthy, good life to very basic conditions. My father was only 6 years old at the time. I will end by saying that 7 of the siblings all went out to work at a very young age to help the family. My dad would help the milkman every day and brought 2 bottles of milk at the end of the day back to the family. They all became very well educated. One became a world-renowned professor. My father was a CEO of a large insurance company in Israel, and they all have large, successful families. Their story is quite impressive to me, and I always remind myself where I came from so I can inspire myself and the future generations to overcome any obstacle life throws at the Jews. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for coming. And thank Rabbi Gadi for inviting me to tell my story. And when discussing indigenousness of Jews in Israel, I represent a relatively new subgroup that is surely native and quite distinct to Israel. My father was born in Belarus, Poland at the time, into a Slonim Hasidic community. He became a Zionist, disappointed some of his family terribly, and left for Israel in 1936. He never saw his parents, 6 sisters, 3 brothers, and some nieces and nephews ever again. They all perished in the Holocaust. Getting off the ship at the port of Jaffa in 1936, my father's first impression of Israel was fairly alarming. He was served pita, Lebanese cheese, and what looked to him like sheepdog. dung sheep. He never saw black olives before. My mother was born in Yemen. She lost her parents at an early age and was married off at the age of 12 years old in order to avoid being sent to an Islamic orphanage. On her wedding night, her older brother and his best friend locked the groom in the basement because she was so scared. My mother arrived in Israel thanks to the Wings of Eagles operation, like Rabbi Gadi's parents. She used to tell us that she never saw an airplane before and was terrified to get in. While en route to Israel, she and her two closest friends went to the bathroom on the airplane together for fear that they would be sucked off the airplane.
My mother and father met in my hometown, Rehovot. My mother worked as a waitress in a laborer's restaurant, and she caught my father's attention when she regularly added an extra piece of meat to the soup.
They married in 1960. At the time, marriage of an Ashkenazi and a Yemenite was not common, and some frowned upon such unions, even in a town like Rehovot, where Yemenites and Ashkenazis lived and worked together for several decades already. My younger siblings and I grew up in a home where my mother was darker than my father. She spoke with het and ayn, and she was comfortable in Arabic, Yemenite style, as in Hebrew. My father was comfortable in Yiddish, as in Hebrew.
And my mother even learned some Yiddish to make sure that the jokes my father shared with his friends were not at her expense.
At home, we used to eat gefilte fish with schog, which is like, okay, so I was like trying to explain, saying that it's like eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with Tabasco. and we used to eat Yemenite soup followed by tzimis.
Like eating an apple pie with I don't know, hot and sour soup. These are my imageries, maybe they help, maybe they don't.
But we didn't know that these mixing of languages and foods were odd. For us, they were normal.
In kindergarten and elementary school, most of the teachers were Ashkenazi, but since I lived in the borderline between two Yemenite neighborhoods, Malmoed and Sha'araim, about 2/3 of the kids were Yemenite. So I guess the large number of Yemenite students sort of balanced out the Ashkenazi teacher number. Football was definitely more important in elementary school than anything else. Since we had no social media, not even TVs.
Most of our free time was spent playing soccer. All the boys at school came from either Sha'araim or Malmo. Both are still Yemenite neighborhoods, and both had their own soccer clubs that competed furiously. So aligning yourself with one club or another was much more important than the divide between the Yemenites and Ashkenazis. Now, when selecting teams at the schoolyard or the playground, no one really made a big deal out of the fact that Yemenites were always selected first. And Ashkenazis were left out with being the goalies. Because what mattered was to win the game, not to be Ashkenazi or Yemenite. When I arrived in junior high, things became different. But for me, and for so many mixed breeds like myself, who served as an example to follow, growing up in such an integrated environment became enriching and enlightening.
And this experience and mixed breed indigenousness, said it 1,000 times today, has since also been expanded in Israel.
And it serves, I think, as a unifying factor
in current Israeli life and culture. Thank you.
Thank you. It's obvious that Israel for us is definitely home for all of us, and we've been connected to it for so long. I want to say that in my family, I feel like there's a group of people, Yemenite people, that just simply moved. They knew each other for 3,000 years in Yemen, and they just simply relocated just, around the corner. So this is who we are, and when I was growing up also in Rehovot, it seemed to have big representation here. But again, I grew up with 25 kids just in my homeroom class, and they all spoke their native languages almost. So they were either themselves immigrants or their parents. So next time when somebody tells you you're not native, you're not indigenous to the land, please know what to respond. And I hope that this event today would just be the first in a series and maybe an annual program that definitely I'll pitch it to Columbia to recognize this day every year and bring stories of Mizrahi and Eastern Sephardi Jews. Okay, thank you. So I really, I don't know if people want to stay online, but please do. And we have about 10 minutes to have a conversation among us.
So first of all, kol hakavod, I think this was wonderful in terms of learning more of the history and in particular people's sharing. So in the next, Al regel echad, on one foot, given your backgrounds, now can you please solve the whole situation in the Middle East right now? Because after all, you are the natural peacemakers for bringing the backgrounds together. So joking aside, if there's anything, obviously it's so important for us Ashkenazim to learn all this, but if any of you have a glimmer that you could give us in terms of what gives you hope from your backgrounds, I guess would be a better way to put the question.
I could just, because, I do a lot of interfaith work with Christians and Muslims. I think that in the Middle East, they recently said that the Middle East speaks Arabic. And it's not just a physical, literal language that we speak, but it's the culture. They speak Arabic, and I think this is where we as Jews from Arab countries can actually help in the conversation and the dialogue, because we speak a similar language. So, of course, it's everybody, but I think this is what gives me hope, that I think this voice is going to maybe come forth more. Anybody else from the panel or the speakers? What gives you hope?
Being together, and I see this amazing unity.
The two goals that I had for this event was, one, to educate about the other half of the Jewish people, that, as we call it, kind of the refugees, the forgotten refugees, that we had experiences that are not recognized. When we talk about the Palestinian plight of displacement from the land in the years surrounding 1948, we're forgetting our stories too. And the similar number of Jews had to be displaced from Arab countries. The other goal that I had for today, and the premises that I wrote for the proposal for Columbia to be able to have this event, is that we are not giving up on interfaith. We're not giving up on trying to be reconciling with our neighbors, with our friendly neighbors, or those who are not necessarily friendly, but definitely don't do what Hamas did on October 7th. I think what they clearly made a mark there, that there's a different level of conversation, that there are people that you cannot have a conversation with, and you have to understand that too. Part of the hope is not just to keep banging your head against the wall. With some people, you just can't talk. But those you can talk with, there's a lot to talk and a lot to do. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming and participating in person, online. We've recorded this event also, not just on Zoom, so we will edit it, add some more jokes, and we'll send it out. Thank you very much, everybody.